Hey guys, in today's video I wanted to go through all of the places that I have lived in and kind of the pros and cons of living there. Now, as a disclaimer, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings who might live in these places. I'm not trying to say negative things about where these places are. It's just my own personal opinion as far as what I liked and maybe didn't like so much. But each area that we've lived in, I've always found something that I loved about it, no matter what. I just want you guys to keep this, very light and not to get offended or anything, because there's just some things that I didn't love about certain places that we've lived in. Alright, the first place, and I'm gonna go in order of when we lived in these places, so I'm gonna start with the first place we lived in as a married couple. And I have notes over here so I don't forget anything, so that's why I'm looking over here. The first place we lived in as a married couple was Portland, Oregon. And the pros, again, these are my opinions. Some people might not like these things about these places. The first thing that I really love about Portland is it's got a very hippie vibe about it. And I just really love like the whole hippie culture thing. Hippie, hipster, I don't know what you want to call it. But I just really love that. Like, there's so many vegan restaurant options there. They have a lot of, like farmers markets, and the Saturday market is a really big one that happens every Saturday. And just things like that I just really love about the culture there. The other thing I love about Oregon is the weather. See, some people don't like Oregon because it rains so much. I'm kind of the opposite. I really love rain, and I love when I don't have to see the sun for a long time. So I really like the weather there. I like that it rains, but it snows very little. Because a lot of people think that rain is terrible, but at least you don't have to shovel rain. You don't have to do anything to rain. It just, drains. Especially when you live a place that it's used to raining there. Then they have like the draining system works and everything, like they have a place for the water to go. And the other thing that I really loved about Oregon, and it was funny because I grew up in Southern California, and it's not completely deserty there, but it's also not super lush with like green life or anything. So going from Southern California and never seeing anything different than that, and then going to Oregon, I thought Oregon was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my life. There are definitely a lot of forests there, bodies of water, trees, it's just really beautiful, and I love being in Oregon. The one con that I can think of is there is a lot of traffic, and the freeways can be kind of confusing, so that part I didn't really love. And it's funny because it's been such a long time since we lived there, because we haven't lived there since we were first married, and we lived there for like a couple of years, and haven't moved back yet. I hope to eventually move back there because I really love Oregon. It's definitely my favorite place. But then we took a trip over there to visit some family not too long ago. I think it was when Link was like 3 or 4 months old. And I realized how bad the traffic really is there. It felt like it took forever to get anywhere when we had to take the freeway. Okay, the second place we lived after living in Oregon, we moved to Peoria, Arizona. The pros for living in Arizona are definitely you always have perfect driving conditions because it hardly ever rains. Like, you'll get some like bouts of like rain here and there, but it's very minimal, and it obviously doesn't snow in Arizona. So you never really have to worry about shoveling or excessive rain or ice or anything like that. So it basically makes for very perfect driving conditions. The only weird driving condition that I ever experienced there was you can occasionally get sandstorms or whatever you want to call them, and I only experienced that one time, and all they recommend is that if you're in the middle of like a sandstorm where it literally is what it sounds like, where there's just sand blowing everywhere and you can't see, almost kind of like if there was fog, like that's how hard it is to see in those. They usually just recommend that you kind of just pull off to the side of the road, stop until it passes, which it usually passes pretty quickly, and then go about your merry way. And that's what I did, and I only experienced that once in the 2 years that we lived there. The con for living in Arizona, and this is not everyone's opinion, some people like the heat, but I am the type of person that, like I said, I don't really love the sun, and I don't like hot weather. So that was very difficult for me to live in a desert environment, because in the summertime it can get like 115 plus degrees in the summer, where you just do not want to leave your house or a bathtub or anything, and you're just sweating out of every pore, and that can be very uncomfortable. And for me, I get really grouchy if I'm that hot. So that wasn't too fun for me. Yeah, just me and my husband are not desert people, but I definitely enjoyed Arizona for other than how hot it was. Living in Arizona was definitely enjoyable. All right, the next place that we lived in was Glendale, California, which Glendale is about 15-ish minutes from LA. So I usually just tell people that I lived in LA, even though it wasn't necessarily in Hollywood. We were just very close to LA. All right, the pros for where we lived, and this doesn't necessarily mean this is how it is in all of LA, but at least the area that we lived in, I got to walk everywhere because traffic is so bad and so congested in LA. That is not a myth. It is very bad. That I ended up just being like, why don't I just walk everywhere? So I got some good walking shoes, a good stroller for my daughter, because at the time she was, what, like 1 or 2? No, she was like 3 or 4 when we first lived there. So I just put her in the stroller and walk everywhere. Like, I walked to the pediatrician's office, I walked to the dentist, the grocery store, everywhere. Everywhere was within walking distance. So I think that's the most activity I've ever gotten when living somewhere, because I walked everywhere and I was in like the best physical condition. It's not like I was ripped or anything, but my legs were really strong, and I definitely got used to just walking everywhere, and I was very fast at it. The other thing I really loved about Glendale, and I kind of mentioned this in my last video about moving frequently, is I really loved the food in Glendale. They have very rich culture there. I love the culture. There's like a lot of Armenians and Greeks and like very heavily Mediterranean, and there's also a lot of Mexican food restaurants that are like authentic Mexican food. I couldn't eat the Mexican food mostly because I was vegan that was when I was first getting into veganism at the time. But my husband loves like legit Mexican, like hole in the wall places. And so there was this place that he went to that he really loved their tacos. And now my favorite restaurant to go to when we lived there, which was only like 2 seconds to walk there, was a place called Scaff's. It's spelled SKAF''S. And it was a Lebanese restaurant, and they were like the nicest people. You could tell it was like a family-owned restaurant. My husband didn't like it as much. He's not as into Mediterranean food as I am. But man, I loved their food. They had like the best falafels ever. There was like super easy menu to get like vegan options and just like get cheese removed from something, or have falafels instead of meat. So I really loved the food in Glendale. Now, the cons for living in Glendale, as I kind of mentioned earlier, was the traffic. I mean, Hollywood and LA is kind of known for having a lot of traffic just because there's a lot of people there. So it just is kind of like, it's just how it goes when you live in a high concentrated area with a lot of people. But the other thing that was kind of it wasn't the best was it was a very high identity theft area, and so that wasn't very fun. So for example, my mother and father-in-law, they were visiting us this one time, and my father-in-law went to get gas, and he used his debit card at a gas station just for like the outside where you just swipe your card and whatnot, and he ended up getting his like card number stolen just from using that. Like someone must have messed with it or something, and yeah, and so there were charges on his card that he didn't do. And you always had to lock your mailboxes because your mail would get stolen a lot. So we had to make sure we had a good, good, secure, and locked mailbox because you just got a lot of mail theft, of people just trying to steal identities and using cards and things like that. So that wasn't great. Okay, the next place that we lived in was Salt Lake, Utah. And one of my favorite things about Salt Lake is definitely that it's a very highly Christian state. It's very prominent that like most of the people there are Christian. Not everybody, obviously, but that was something that I really liked about it, is most of the time you meet other people with the same faith as you, and so that was very, I don't know, it was very nice, and I really liked that about it. I also really like the weather in Utah, even though it does snow. I don't mind it as much. It doesn't snow as badly as other places that I've lived in, and or other places that just exist. It's not too bad, and the city and just the state's really good at clearing roads very quickly and making it safe for everyone. But during the summer, it's just really nice during the spring and summer. And the last thing that I really loved about Utah is they surprisingly had a lot of vegan restaurant options. There was one that was actually a raw restaurant, and I went there a few times. My husband didn't love it. He's not as into raw foods as I am. And I'm not fully raw, but I definitely enjoy raw restaurants. But yeah, there was a lot of vegan restaurant options, and so that was really nice. So I always felt like I had some place to eat and a little bit of a variety. This is kind of a funny thing, is I couldn't think of any cons for living in Utah. I could think of cons for everywhere else. And I was gonna say traffic again, but really Utah traffic is nothing compared to LA or Oregon or those other places that I've lived in. So, I don't know. I don't really have anything that I didn't like about Utah. I sat there for like 10 minutes just trying to think, was there something I didn't like? And I just really couldn't think of anything. So, no cons for me on Utah. And the last place that I lived in recently, is where we just left, was kind of like it was Hockessin, Wilmington area in the state of Delaware. Now, the pros for Delaware was it's very beautiful. Like, so to give you an example, and it was funny because I've been to Oregon, and Oregon is very beautiful and it's very green. But what Delaware has that Oregon doesn't is it has colors. And it was something that I didn't really expect. And I've never experienced the East Coast. It was like the very first time my husband and I had ever lived on the East Coast before in our lives. So it was a very interesting experience. To give you an idea of my first glimpse at Delaware, it was very funny. So my husband went there ahead of us because we got a job transfer over there. So me and my daughter flew to Delaware, just the two of us later on. When we arrived, it was nighttime, like really late at night. So it was dark. I was really tired. I was also kind of nauseous from the flight. So I couldn't really see anything. So we get to the house. I go to sleep, sleep really good for the first night. And my husband had gone to work that morning. So when I woke up my first morning there, I was like, oh, I'll finally be able to see what this place looks like because Lee's been telling me how pretty it is. I opened my window and I knew there was a forest behind us because my husband told me, but I opened the window and I literally gasped because behind us was a forest, and we arrived there, gosh, when was it? I think it was in October, so it was right as the leaves were changing and there was like pretty fall colors everywhere, and it just took my breath away how beautiful these were. And these trees were so gigantic. They were so huge. They were like the size of skyscrapers or something. Maybe I'm being over dramatic, but that's how big they seemed. They're huge trees. And they're not just evergreens, so they all have colors and like colors that I didn't even know existed on trees. it was beautiful. So the first thing I wanted to do was go into the backyard, which the forest actually had a little path behind it. So I was like, oh, this is so cool. So me and my daughter, got dressed and we kind of like explored the forest behind us. And I was just like, I felt like I was in a fairy tale. Like I felt like any minute now there were going to be tiny little fairies floating around me and little fairy-like creatures coming out of the woods, because it just looked so fantasy-like. So that was something that I just remember thinking, this is so beautiful. So hands down, Delaware is very, very beautiful. The other thing that I really loved about Delaware is the weather is very similar to Oregon. It rains a lot, and I was kind of surprised by that, because no one will say that it rains that much, but it really does. We lived there for 2 years, and it rained almost just as much as it did in Oregon when we lived in Oregon. And so you have a lot of like overcast days and cloudy and rainy, and I just loved it. Obviously it snows too. It snows more than Oregon does. So you definitely have to deal with cold and shoveling and things like that a bit more than you would in Oregon, but that wasn't that big of a deal to me because I was used to snow by then. The last thing that is really cool about living in Delaware is you are within driving distance of really awesome places like New York City, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. Like there's just a ton of places that you are close enough that you can just drive there. We were able to visit New York, and maybe I'll put in a few pictures of our trip. I was kind of sad. So I took a lot of pictures of our New York trip, and somehow they're gone. Like I only have like a few left, and I was really sad because I took so many photos when we took our New York trip, and I lost like most of the photos. But we did go, we saw New Jersey a little bit, and we also visited Philadelphia, like going downtown Philly was really neat. We got to visit all the historical sites and museums and the zoo in Washington, D.C. And so there's just a lot of cool things to see around Delaware. Alright, so this is the last thing on my list, and it's the cons for Delaware. The biggest thing for me was there are so many deer. I mean, I can't even like express how high of a deer problem there is in Delaware. And most people would think like, oh, but deer don't really do anything, and they're nice. But there's two problems that come with a high concentration of deer in an area. One is it causes a lot of car accidents because they just really love to jump in front of those cars and freak people out and cause accidents. And the other thing that comes with a lot of wild deer is ticks. Yes, you heard me right. There are a lot of ticks, and that's kind of just what comes with wildlife. And since there's a lot of deer, there are a lot of ticks. And I remember back when I lived in Delaware, I had a dog, and he was constantly getting ticks on him, and it was just really cringy. And there were several people that I knew that actually got Lyme disease from ticks there, and it's definitely a problem. And I didn't love that. Although the few times that we came across deer when we were walking through the forest in our backyard, I mean, they're very sweet animals, and they're so beautiful. And so that is definitely an enjoyable part of the wildlife, and there is something to be enjoyed about deer, but those are the two things that are not so great. Luckily, I never did hit a deer while I lived there. We lived there 2 years, and I never hit a deer, thankfully. But my husband came close a few times, and there was one road in particular where they just really loved to come out of nowhere And luckily on that road I always went as slow as I legally could, so if they popped out of nowhere I wasn't going too fast. Alright, the other con for living in Delaware, it's not a big deal to people who have lived there their whole lives, but for an outsider moving to Delaware, this is frustrating. So first of all, their street signs are tiny. They are tiny. It doesn't matter if it's a big road, small road, whatever. All the street signs are really hard to see. And I have bad vision anyways. I have to wear glasses when I drive. And even with my glasses, I cannot read the street signs because they're so small. But along with the street signs being small, it's very confusing because... Okay, how do I explain this? So, it's very weird because I've never seen this in any other state. And I don't know if this is a thing in other states. I don't know. But... the thing is with the street signs is, so for example, and this isn't an actual street, but let's say there's a street named Williams, and it says Williams, but it is also known as 45th. Again, this isn't a real street, but I'm just saying this as an example. So let's say I'm on my GPS, and it tells me to turn right on 45th. But the only street sign says Williams. And whenever I talked about this to people who are used to it, they're like, oh, you just get used to it and you just have to memorize it. I'm like, what if I'm not here that long? So there was a lot of confusion as to what a street was, because there was a number labeled to it as well as a name to every street. So it was so confusing because I'd be driving around, I'm like, I don't know where I am, I'm looking for this number street, but there are no numbers, it's only words, and vice versa, and oh my gosh, it's so confusing. I think that's the most confusing place I've ever had to drive in. And on top of it, not only the street signs, but they have a lot of windy roads, like a lot of this and this, and I have like severe motion sickness. So driving on those roads, especially for long periods of time, I would get very sick. Even as being the driver, I would get kind of sick. So that wasn't super fun. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I definitely had fun kind of like reminiscing about all the places that I've lived in. And a few of these places I didn't mention because in each state we've moved to a few different towns within a state, but I just wanted to keep it simple and just to go with the main ones that we lived in. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.